All right, so yes, tonight is a testimony night. As I mentioned in the past, we have 25 lessons throughout the year. Every other week we give a lesson, or we have a lesson. Last week we had our first lesson, which was denial, and so this is the in-between week between that lesson and the next one, and it's a testimony night. And most of our testimonies are live testimonies, and so I'm going to be kicking off the year by giving you my testimony. Now, when I introduce myself, I always usually say, I'm a grateful Christian who sometimes still struggles with love and abandonment issues, and my name is Bob. So as I give you my testimony tonight, I think you'll understand why I introduce myself that way. I was born in Globe, Arizona, which is a small mining community approximately 90 miles east of Phoenix. Several years later, my family moved to Williams Air Force Base, which was 30 miles south of Phoenix near a town called Chandler. My dad had taken a job as a house painter for the Air Force, and we moved into a brand new 2-bedroom house on the base. And I still remember the new smell of the house and the wood shavings that were still on the floor. When I was 7 years old, I went to a little country grammar school that was located approximately halfway between the Air Force Base and Chandler. I still remember the first day of school and how scared and confused I was. I remember I didn't know the routines. I didn't know where I was supposed to be. I didn't know which class I was supposed to be in. And I remember that I was extremely embarrassed. But fortunately, it all worked out, and I ended up in the first grade. It didn't take very long for the teacher to decide that I was too advanced for the class, and I was moved into the second grade. My mother had been homeschooling me before I went to school, and I guess I was ahead of everybody at the first grade level. Now, even though this was a positive experience, I still felt fearful and uncomfortable. I never communicated this to my parents because I felt too ashamed at being scared. Looking back on it now, I am sure that my mother would have listened and been very sympathetic. But I remember my dad being stern and remote, so I just kept everything to myself. The following year, a grammar school was opened up on the Air Force Base, and I was enrolled in the third grade. My mother was extremely protective, and she insisted that I wear hiking boots to school because she thought they would provide me with good ankle support. Now, this ordinarily wouldn't bother me, but the other kids noticed it and began to make fun of me, as well as my mother's overprotectiveness. And this got me into numerous fights with other boys. I didn't like fighting, so I tried to avoid them wherever I could. I remember one time I was fighting one of my tormentors in the middle of the playground, and of course this attracted a lot of attention. And one of the teachers came up, and I fully expected her to break it up. But instead, she just stood there and watched. Periodically, she would give me suggestions on how better to fight this kid. I remember being very angry and also humiliated at the same time. During these years, my father contracted cancer, and I remember him being sick most of the time. Finally, when he couldn't work any longer, we moved to Chandler, and there my mother went to work in a restaurant as a waitress. She didn't make very much money, and we barely could get by. In the meantime, my father got progressively worse. I remember that he was in a lot of pain, and he would ask me to give him his pain shots, which I really didn't want to do. I was not a very good shot giver, and every time I gave him an injection, he would wince with pain. And finally, my father succumbed to cancer when I was 10 years old. My mother did the best she could to earn a living for us during this time. I remember she also took an ironing from the local cleaners. And we moved into a low-income housing complex in Chandler, and I can still remember the squalid conditions and the feeling that we were at the very, very bottom. One year at Christmas season, I remember going to the local Firestone store every day, where they had a wonderful display of Lionel trains. They were all beautiful, different cars and engines and tracks. And I just loved to go there and look at them and fantasize. I really wanted one of those trains so bad. I remember my younger brother saved his pennies, and he bought me a little plastic engine with a couple of plastic cars as his Christmas present to me. And he was so proud, but for me it was a bittersweet experience. This went on for the next 2 years until my mom contracted breast cancer. When she finally couldn't work any longer, the local priest put us into a little apartment adjacent to the church. Shortly after that, my mother died. But before she passed away, she gave me some instructions on how to contact my aunt, her sister in California. I remember calling my aunt and telling her that Mom had died. She responded very coldly and said, "Well, just guess we're going to have to come and get you." Approximately a week later, my cousin showed up to take my brother and I back to California. He told us just to get our clothes and leave the rest. We didn't have very much, so it didn't really seem like a big deal to me. However, reflecting on it now, I wish we had taken some time to look things over a little more closely. In California, we lived on a 640-acre ranch, which was owned by my cousin. My aunt and her daughter also lived there too. At this point, I was 12 years old, and my brother was 10. Now, my brother and I were treated as outsiders right from the very beginning. Actually, we were treated pretty much like hired hands. We had lots of chores to do, including milking 3 cows twice a day, helping with 300 head of sheep, and helping with planting and harvesting grain crops. In spite of all the work we did, we were continuously ostracized from the family. We were not even allowed to use the bathroom facilities in the house. We had to use an outdoor outhouse, and we had to rely on sponge baths in the back porch wash tray for personal hygiene. We also had to wash our clothes on the back porch using a washboard, even though there was a brand new washing machine standing by. And during this time, I went to high school in a town approximately 20 miles away. I went back and forth on a school bus that was provided by the school district. Now, this arrangement precluded me from participating in any school activities after school. And I remember feeling isolated and alone and different. And what made it particularly hurtful was that my aunt's daughter was allowed to do some of these things, and they made arrangements to pick her up. After approximately 3 years of this treatment, my brother and I became quite rebellious. I remember one incident in the barn where my cousin was angry with my brother for something that he did, and he threatened to hit him. I was standing in the loft area of the barn, and I was holding a pitchfork. I told my cousin to back off, or I would run him through with a pitchfork. And I really meant it. And he looked at me, and he knew I meant it too. Unfortunately, he backed off. However, several days later, we were turned over to the state of California as wards of the court, and we were classified as incorrigible. Now, I don't think the state knew what to do with us at the time, so they put us in juvenile hall. And there my brother and I were put into isolation for approximately 3 to 4 weeks until foster homes could be found. I was ultimately put into a foster home which was owned by a school teacher who had lost her husband several years prior. And my brother was placed in another foster home with a very nice family. And this was the first time that we'd ever been apart. The good news was that the 2 foster homes were fairly close to each other, so we could see each other often. One day after about 6 months had passed by, my brother asked if he could move in with me and the school teacher. And joy of joys, the school teacher said yes. My brother and I were reunited. The school teacher was a very hurting woman. She was still grieving the loss of her husband. As a result, she suffocated me with her love and attention. There were times when it got close to being inappropriate. And this was confusing, and I really didn't know what to do, especially since I was a teenage boy with raging hormones. However, I managed best as I could until I finished my senior year of high school. As soon as I graduated, I went off to college and essentially severed all ties with the school teacher. First year of college was extremely difficult for me. I felt very alone. My brother and I had drifted apart. He was still in high school, and he was primarily interested in girls and sports. So I looked for other relationships to fill the void. I desperately looked for a girlfriend, but I was awkward and often too eager. So I experienced a lot of rejection. Eventually, there was one girl who did show some interest, but she had so many personal problems that she was really incapable of having any kind of relationship. Somehow, I managed to get through college. I'm not too sure how. I had no money. I had to work my way through. At one point, things got so bad financially, I had decided to quit. And at the time, I was working for the Franchise Tax Board as a stock clerk. The director heard about my decision, and he came to me personally and counseled me against doing it. I was so blown away that he would take an interest in me that I decided to take his advice and remain in school as best I could. Somehow I was able to continue until my senior year. When I only had 1 semester to go, I ran out of money again, so I decided to drop out and work for a semester in order to accumulate enough money to finish. And one of my teachers heard about this and offered to co-sign a loan for me so I could borrow enough money and finish my education. Once again, I was blown away that someone would do this for me. I accepted the teacher's offer, I borrowed the money, and was able to graduate. During this time, I met a woman who I became interested in. She was a pretty redhead and seemed interested in me too. We dated during my senior year, and we became serious. After graduation, I went directly into the service. In those days, the Vietnam War and the draft were going strong, so going into the military was an inevitable experience. As soon as I graduated from college, I was in the Army. Fortunately, I didn't have to go to Vietnam, and I actually spent all of my active duty in Fort Ord, California, right next to Monterey. This was great duty, and it enabled me to continue seeing my girlfriend. When I was finally discharged from active duty, my girlfriend and I got married. Things went well for the first 5 years of our marriage. I went to work for AT&T in a management training program. We moved to Marin County and had 3 children. However, in the 5th year of our marriage, my wife began having serious bouts of depression. We began seeing a psychiatrist, and she was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Extensive therapy followed for a number of years, and during that time she underwent many electroshock treatments with only modest results. And during that time she attempted to commit suicide 4 different occasions, and she finally succeeded in her 5th attempt. At that time our kids were ages 6 and 8 and 10. That was an extremely difficult time for me. I always knew sooner or later that she was going to take her life. I thought I was prepared for it, but as it turned out, I wasn't. I was a complete mess, and I didn't know what to do. I finally decided I had to continue working at AT&T, and I had to continue focusing on raising my kids. I decided I didn't want to get involved in another relationship right away, even though I felt alone and isolated. So I hired a housekeeper to take care of the household, and I moved ahead. The plan worked okay for a while until something happened that literally changed my life. I met a terrific woman named Gail. A mutual friend offered to introduce me to her. I didn't want to at first because I really didn't like this mutual friend particularly, and I felt that any friend of hers would be just like her, and I didn't want to know this other person. But I finally agreed, and I'm sure glad I did, because Gail was the most incredible woman I have ever known. She was sweet, intelligent, beautiful, erudite, beautiful, loving, kind, beautiful. She was everything I could ever possibly imagine in a woman. And the best part, she had no psychological issues. So we began seeing each other. The attraction was magnetic. We were drawn to each other. We were so compatible. And it didn't take me very long to forget about my decision to avoid getting into another relationship. Approximately 4 months after meeting her, I proposed to her. And 5 months after that, we got married. She had 2 daughters, ages 8 and 12, and of course I still had my 3. So we amalgamated our 2 families. We were now the Brady Bunch. Now let me tell you, bringing 2 families together was a very interesting experience. There were many joys and there were also many sorrows as we grew together as a family. And we had many tests. My oldest son decided to run away from home. And praise the Lord, we were able to track him down and bring him back. And that's a whole other story. My young son decided to become a drug dealer. And that lasted for a short time until we busted him. 2 of my daughters decided to steal a neighbor's car and go joyriding at 2 a.m. in the morning. And I think they were 14 at the time. Now, they might have gotten away with it, except they ran a red light going 40 miles an hour right in front of a policeman who happened to be at an intersection. In addition to all this, there were several automobile accidents that totaled 3 cars. Fortunately, no one was hurt. And there were many other incidents as well. Gail and I could literally write a book. During this time, a neighbor across the street who was a Christian saw what was going on at our house, and she invited Gail to a women's retreat in Mission Springs. Gail went, and it was there that she accepted the Lord into her life. She came home and informed us that we were going to go to church. And that was okay with me because I had been raised in the Catholic Church and thought religion was a good thing. And I thought it probably would be good for the kids too. So we started going to First Covenant Church in Oakland. And I immediately became fascinated with the preaching. I never heard preaching like that before. It was all about the problems of life and how to deal with them through the Lord. It was all about having a relationship with Jesus Christ. That was the first time I'd ever heard that. And so after about 6 months, I prayed to receive Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. About this time, AT&T decided to reorganize, and they began downsizing the company. Many positions at my job level were being consolidated or eliminated. The company offered me a choice to stay on at a lower paying position or leave. If I left, they offered me a year's wages and a vested pension. So after much thought and much prayer, I chose to leave. And that was a very scary decision. The economy was in terrible shape, kind of like it is today, and unemployment was high. I had 5 kids and a wife to support and a large home in the Oakland Hills to pay for, and needless to say, I was terrified. So I decided to do the safest thing I could do in that kind of economic environment. I decided to start my own business. I figured that since I had a year's wages, I had a year to make a go of it. So I decided to go into the real estate investment business. I had been a real estate investor for a number of years, so it just seemed like a natural choice. However, it was probably the worst time to get in this kind of business because interest rates were at 20% at that particular time. But the good news was that there was a lot of properties available because nobody was buying or selling anything. So I managed to find a few properties that penciled out, even at 20%. I formed some partnerships, and I bought them, and that inaugurated my investment business. The business lasted approximately 10 years. And toward the end, I remember praying one day and asking the Lord to use me in the most fruitful way. I told him that he was free to use me any way he saw fit. And you've probably heard it said that we should be careful what we pray for. In this case, I was totally unprepared for what was about to happen. In a word, my business came to a crashing halt. About that time, the government decided to enact some new tax laws which took away all tax incentives for real estate partnerships, which was the business that I was in. All of a sudden, I couldn't raise a dime of capital. In addition, the earthquake of 1989 completely destroyed a 98-unit apartment building in which I was a major partner. I remember on the morning of the earthquake, I woke up with a huge equity in the building, and that evening I went to bed with 0 equity. I had lost it all, and I couldn't believe what had happened. From that point on, life became increasingly miserable. I lost my other buildings through foreclosure. Properties that had been good performing properties turned into bad performing properties. And I was sued by several lenders and battled lawsuits for the better part of 2 years. All during this time, I did not file bankruptcy, even though I thought seriously about it a number of times. However, my partner did file bankruptcy and left me holding the bag. Ultimately, I lost everything, including my beautiful home in the Oakland Hills, where we had raised our 5 kids. I went from being a millionaire to being homeless, jobless, and penniless. I remember telling Gail, babe, I don't think we can go any lower than this. And it was absolutely true. Now, while all this was going on, I had become involved with the Creekside Community Church. John Bruce, who was the minister of small groups at First Covenant Church in Oakland, had the vision of planting a church in San Leandro. He asked Gail and me if we would be interested in joining him, and we were. Approximately 2 years later, on September 1990, we were part of the planting team that planted Creekside Community Church in San Leandro. During the next 2 years after that, I tried several different ways to earn a living. I tried owning and operating a retail store. I tried doing real estate brokerage, and I tried doing consulting. However, it didn't matter what I tried to do, nothing worked. I felt like God kept closing doors. Finally, the opportunity came up for me to go to work for Creekside Church, and I have been here ever since. I'd like to digress a moment now and just go back to the time when I became a Christian. That was back in 1977. Immediately after committing myself to Christ, I went on an accelerated program of learning about the Christian faith. I would listen to radio broadcasts which featured prominent preachers. I did this nearly every day for well over 5 years. One preacher that I was particularly interested in was John MacArthur. I got his study books and used them diligently as I followed his daily broadcasts. I also did the same thing with other preachers such as Charles Swindoll, David Hawking, who was popular at the time, and J. Vernon McGee. In addition, I received regular teaching at First Covenant Church, and I regularly attended several Bible studies. I also started leading my own Bible study as well as various small groups, which I did for over 10 years. Needless to say, I accumulated a great deal of head knowledge. However, I was seriously lacking in heart knowledge. And it wasn't until I went through the pain of my business failure that my growth as a Christian really began. When I lost everything, I realized that I was still that young boy who was essentially afraid of life. I was fearful of other people. I felt inadequate. I felt different. I felt like a failure. And I still felt alone. I didn't know how to verbalize my feelings. And even if I could verbalize them, I didn't think that there was anyone who would listen. Not even Gail, as unimaginable as that might seem. And so I stuffed my pain, put on good appearances. Everybody thought I had it together, but deep inside I was empty, hurting, and dying. I knew Jesus Christ was a biblical character who actually existed, but I never really understood the power of his message and his ministry. I thought that I was still responsible to change my life and that Christ would help me if I needed it and if he felt inclined. At the same time, I realized I didn't have any personal resources. I had no personal power. So deep inside, I felt a growing sense of hopelessness. When my business failed and I was stripped of everything, I finally got on my knees. I asked the Lord what to do. And that's when my journey as a Christian really began. I began to see that he really wanted the best for me. I began to see that he had redirected my life for a purpose. I realized that he only looked at me with eyes of love and never disapproval. I was overjoyed as I began to understand these truths, because up to this point, I didn't like myself very much. I always felt there was something wrong with me, because all the important people in my life had either rejected me or left me. However, I could see that God had not, and that he would not. My progress in these areas accelerated when I got into Celebrate Recovery 10 years ago. My senior pastor came to me one day and said he had heard about a recovery program called Celebrate Recovery, and he asked me to check into it and see if it was worthwhile. I ordered all the materials and studied them intently and concluded that it had some merit. And so I told my senior pastor that we should implement it, and he gave me the green light. As I started leading Celebrate Recovery, I began to see that I was the one who really needed it. I needed to admit that I had a problem with rejection and abandonment and low self-esteem. In spite of all the progress that God had made in my life up to this point, I still had anxiety about relationships. I still believed that I was generally worthless and that sooner or later people would find out and reject me. I still had fear of intimacy, and sometimes when I looked inside, I saw nothing of value. Celebrate Recovery, I came to see that Jesus doesn't look at me that way, but made me finally understand that it was the cross. I finally understood that Jesus willingly allowed himself to be tortured and killed so that the penalty for my sins could be paid. He did this because I am valuable to him. For the first time in my life, I began to realize I had some value in his eyes. Jesus really does love me. He's always loved me, and I came to understand that I have worth in the eyes of the God of the universe. That was a huge, revolutionary idea. Can't tell you what it means to me. Celebrate Recovery, I've also learned that Jesus wants me to love other people in the same way. And this includes all people, even those who have rejected me or hurt me. I also learned that I can do this because Jesus gives me the power to do it. So this has inspired me now to reach out to other people. And as I've done that, I've also experienced another benefit. I found out that I truly do love other people, perhaps for the first time in my life. My perspective of other people has changed. I no longer view them with suspicion. I don't have to worry about being accepted as worthy. Jesus loves me, and he's willing, and he's calling me to love others, and that's all that matters. Love really does cover a multitude of sins. As I began to respond to him, he began to cleanse me. For the first time in my life, my quest for personal holiness started to bear fruit. My interest in money and power and sex and prestige and all those things began to diminish. I'd like to say that all these things are now gone. That's just simply not true. However, the progress is very amazing. I now know that I can look to him for everything I need in my life, and he satisfies me through my loving wife, my terrific family, all the wonderful friends he's placed in my life, and most of all, through his loving presence in my life. I would like to close with a verse that has come to mean a great deal to me. It is Galatians 2, verses 20 and 21, and it says, "My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Thank you for letting me share.